Welcome to the deep dive. There's something about gladiators, those figures battling it out in the Roman arena, that just grabs your imagination.
Oh, absolutely.
We've all seen glimpses in movies or maybe even walked through the Colosseum, and you can't help but wonder, who are these people and what was the deal with those, well, brutal games?
It's a timeless fascination, isn't it?
Mm,
And it speaks to something fundamental, I think, about spectacle, courage, and maybe even how societies grapple with violence.
right.
Today, we're really digging into the world of gladiators. We're using the comprehensive Wikipedia entry as our main source material here.
Okay.
Our aim is to go beyond the popular image and understand who these armed combatants truly were, the events they participated in, and crucially, their complex and often surprising role within Roman society.
Okay, so to start us off, when we say gladiator, what exactly are we talking about? We have this picture in our heads, but let's try and nail down a clear definition.
Okay, so essentially, a gladiator was an armed fighter who entertained audiences in both the Roman Republic and the Empire through, well, violent confrontation.
Right. Violent.
And these weren't just one-on-one duels either. They also faced wild animals and, in a pretty grim aspect of the games, condemned criminals.
Condemned criminals. Wow. And then when we think about who became a gladiator, it wasn't all heroes seeking glory, was it? Sounds like a much darker reality for most.
That's exactly right. While a few individuals did volunteer, risking their social standing for the potential rewards of fame and fortune in the arena,
Sure, the glamour.
the vast majority of gladiators were far less fortunate. Most were despised slaves, often subjected to incredibly harsh training regimes. They were socially marginalized, even in death, which really highlights their, well, very low status in Roman society.
So on one hand, they're like at the very bottom, but then you hear about them being cheered and admired. That seems like a real contradiction.
It is a profound contradiction. I
Yeah.
mean, despite their low social standing, gladiators presented this powerful image of Roman martial values to the spectators.
Huh. Martial values.
Yeah, their ability to fight with skill and even to face death with courage. Um, that could inspire genuine admiration and popular acclaim. Think about it. In a society that places such a high premium on military strength,
Right, the legions and all that.
these individuals, even those forced into the arena, they sort of embodied a certain kind of bravery and discipline. And that's why they were celebrated in various forms of art. And their image and perceived value were commemorated on everyday objects across the Roman world.
It's a complicated picture, this mix of revulsion and respect. Okay, now let's talk about where this all began. Gladiatorial combat wasn't just something the Romans, invented out of nowhere, was it?
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Precise origins are, well, debated, as the early historical accounts give us slightly different versions. Nicholas of Damascus, writing back in the late 1st century BC, he believed the practice came from the Etruscans.
Etruscans, okay.
Then, about a generation later, Livy suggested a Campanian origin around 310 BC, linking it to the celebration of a victory over the Samnites.
Campanian.
Yeah.
So different region.
Exactly. And interestingly, much later, like 7th century AD, Isidore of Seville connected the Latin word lanista. That's the term for a gladiator manager.
Ah, the manager.
Yeah, he connected that to an Etruscan word for executioner, and even saw a link between the official who accompanied the dead in the arena and the Etruscan underworld figure Carun. So for a long time, this Etruscan connection was kind of the prevailing theory.
But modern historians have a slightly different take on it now, don't they?
Yes, many modern scholars looking at the visual evidence now lean towards a Campanian origin, or at least a significant borrowings from that region. Campania is where the earliest known gladiator training schools, the Ludi, were located.
To schools, right.
What's really compelling are these tomb frescoes discovered at Paestum, that's a Campanian city, dating back to the 4th century BC.
4th century BC, wow.
And these show pairs of fighters with helmets, spears, and shields in what looks like a propitiatory funeral blood rite. This imagery is strikingly similar to the early Roman gladiator games.
Ah, okay.
Compared to this, the evidence from Etruscan tomb paintings is, well, less direct and comes from a later period. It's even possible that the Paestum frescoes represent a continuation of an even older tradition, perhaps acquired from Greek colonists in the 8th century BC.
So really old roots then.
Could be. So, while the exact starting point is debated, think of it like this. Both the Etruscans and Campanians likely played a role, with the Campanian connection being maybe stronger in the early Roman context, particularly with those funeral blood rite depictions.
So potentially a long and evolving tradition. Now, Livy also mentioned the first Roman games. What can you tell us about that pivotal event?
Right, Livy places the first Roman gladiator games in 264 BC during the First Punic War. A guy named Decimus Junius Brutus Scaeva held a munus, which literally means gift, but here it's more like a commemorative duty, to his deceased father. 3 pairs of gladiators fought to the death in the Forum Boarium, which was Rome's cattle market.
The cattle market. Okay.
Livy emphasizes that the munus was a way for descendants to honor the manes, the spirits of their ancestors. The development of the munus and the different types of gladiators that emerged were significantly influenced by the Samnite support for Hannibal and the subsequent Roman military campaigns against them. The Samnite gladiator type actually became the earliest, the most frequently mentioned, and probably most popular.
And Livy actually gives a specific reason for this connection to the Samnites, doesn't he? It wasn't just a random choice of who to imitate in the arena.
Exactly. Livy recounts that during the Samnite Wars, the Samnites adorned their battle lines with new and elaborate armor, some inlaid with gold and silver. Fancy stuff.
Showing off.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The Romans, in contrast, valued a more practical, ironclad appearance and, courage over such ornamentation. After a Roman victory, the captured Samnite armor was displayed during a triumphal procession.
Right, the spoils of war.
Then Livy states that the Romans used this splendid armor to honor their gods, while their Campanian allies, out of pride and a certain animosity towards the Samnites, equipped gladiators in this fashion for their feasts, even giving them the name Samnites.
Ah, so it's a bit of rubbing it in their faces, too.
Kind of. So Livy presents gladiatorial combat as this morally instructive form of historic reenactment, where these exotically armed barbarians are dominated by Roman valor. He sort of downplays any funereal or sacrificial aspects, focusing instead on the theatrical and the morally uplifting narrative of Roman strength overcoming its enemies.
Makes sense.
And as Rome's power expanded, other conquered peoples would also lend their names and fighting styles to the gladiatorial repertoire.
It's fascinating how these early games were so deeply connected to military conquest and remembrance. Now, how did these initial, perhaps more private munera evolve into the massive public spectacles we often associate with gladiators?
Yeah, the evolution was a gradual but significant process. Early munera were indeed primarily private commemorative events, munera gladiatoria. However, we see them becoming more public and more extravagant relatively quickly.
How quick?
Well, in 216 BC, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus was honored with 3 days of munera in the Forum Romanum, featuring 22 pairs of gladiators. Just 10 years later, Scipio Africanus held a commemorative nunus in Iberia for his father and uncle, and remarkably, high-status non-Romans, and possibly even Romans, volunteered as gladiators.
Volunteers, high-status ones.
Yeah. The context of the Punic Wars and the near disaster at Cannae suggests these early games served to boost morale, celebrate military victories, and offer religious expiation after setbacks. They seem to have been a way to reinforce Roman identity and resilience during a period of significant military threat and expansion.
Okay.
So, you see, the arena was already becoming a stage for Roman identity and a way to process major societal events.
So almost like a form of national therapy through spectacle. Is that too much?
No, you could certainly see it that way. The next recorded munus in 183 BC for Publius Licinius was even more lavish. 3 days of funeral games, 120 gladiators, and a public distribution of meat, the visceratio data,
Free meat.
which echoes those Campanian banquet fights Livy described. The rapid adoption of munera gladiatoria by Rome's Iberian allies demonstrates how quickly this culture spread. By 174 BC, smaller munera, both private and public, were likely becoming commonplace, perhaps so much so that only the more extravagant ones, like Titus Flaminius's 4-day event with 74 gladiators, were deemed worthy of recording.
And then the state itself gets involved, right? That feels like a really major turning point.
It absolutely was. In 105 BC, the consuls offered Rome its first taste of state-sponsored barbarian combat, using gladiators from Capua as part of the military training program.
Military training. Interesting.
And this proved incredibly popular. Following this, gladiator contests, previously largely confined to private munera, were increasingly included in the state games, the ludi, that accompanied major religious festivals.
So merging with existing festivals.
Exactly. While traditional ludis were dedicated to deities, the munera could be dedicated to an aristocratic sponsor's divine or heroic ancestors, further blurring the lines between religious observance and personal commemoration.
This really sets the stage for the peak of the gladiator games. What did that era look like? It sounds like things really took off.
Oh, they exploded.
Yeah.
The peak, roughly from the 1st century BC to the 2nd century AD, saw the gladiator games explode in scale and significance. Sponsors, whether ambitious individuals or established elites, used the games as incredibly expensive but highly effective tools for self-promotion.
Politics, basically.
Totally. They offered thrilling entertainment to clients and potential voters at little or no personal cost to the audience. Gladiators became big business for trainers, owners, and politicians alike.
Right.
A politically savvy private citizen might even postpone a deceased father's munus to coincide with election season, hoping a spectacular show would sway votes.
Clever. Or cynical.
Both, probably. Even those already in power understood the need to maintain the support of the plebeians, and the promise of exceptional games could be a powerful political tool. Sulla, during his time as praetor, famously bent his own sumptuary laws to put on the most lavish munus Rome had ever seen for his wife's funeral.
Wow.
So you see, the arena became this crucial stage for Roman political theater, a place where power was not just wielded, but also performed for the masses. This highlights a key insight into how Roman leaders understood and, well, manipulated public opinion.
So it's deeply embedded in the political landscape, and we see individuals wielding significant power through their gladiatorial holdings, like private armies almost.
Absolutely. In the late Republic, any aristocratic owner of a substantial number of gladiators possessed considerable political leverage. Think of Julius Caesar. In 65 BC, as a newly elected aedile, he held games he framed as a munus for his father, who had been dead for 2 decades.
20 years, that's stretching the memorial aspect a bit.
Just a bit. Despite being heavily in debt, he used an astonishing 320 pairs of gladiators adorned in silvered armor. He had even more gladiators down in Capua, but the Senate, still wary after the Spartacus revolt and concerned about Caesar's growing private armies and popularity, imposed a limit of 320 pairs that any citizen could keep in Rome.
So they tried to put the brakes on.
They tried. Caesar's showmanship was unprecedented in scale and cost, effectively blurring the distinction between a munus as a memorial rite and the state ludi.
And this trend of grand spectacles only intensified with the rise of the empire, didn't it? Bigger and bigger.
It did. Gladiatorial games, often combined with beast shows, Venetianese, spread throughout the Republic and beyond. While there were attempts to curb their political use through anti-corruption laws, these largely failed.
Predictably.
Yeah. After Caesar's assassination and the ensuing civil war, Augustus solidified imperial control over the games, including munera, formalizing their provision as a civic and religious duty.
Making it official policy.
Right. He revised sumptuary laws, setting caps on private and public expenditure on munera, ostensibly to protect the elite from bankruptcy and limiting gladiator munera to the festivals of Saturnalia and Quinquantria. Imperial praetors were allowed a maximum of 120 gladiators at a cost ceiling, while imperial ludi had a minimum cost. The most significant and celebrated games became tied to the state-sponsored imperial cult, further enhancing public recognition and respect for the emperor.
The Emperor's Games.
Exactly. Trajan's games celebrating his Dacian victories are legendary, reportedly involving 10,000 gladiators and 11,000 animals over 123 days.
10,000 gladiators. That number is staggering.
It's almost unbelievable. Despite continued legislation, the cost of gladiators in munera continued to escalate, a trend even Marcus Aurelius couldn't effectively control. This incredible investment in spectacle couldn't last forever, though. Let's maybe turn now to the factors that led to the eventual decline of these seemingly unstoppable games.
Yeah, it sounds like an unstoppable force of entertainment and political theater. But eventually, the games did decline. What factors led to that? It couldn't just keep escalating forever.
No, exactly. The decline was a gradual process, not really a sudden end. The crisis of the 3rd century AD put immense pressure on the imperial finances due to increasing military demands.
Money troubles.
Yep. Lesser magistrates found funding the obligatory munera an increasingly burdensome tax. However, emperors continued to subsidize the games because, well, public interest remained strong.
People still wanted the shows.
Oh, yeah. The rise of Christianity also played a role, though. Early Christian writers like Tertullian condemned the games, viewing them as murder and idolatry due to their pagan religious rituals.
Right, the pagan connection.
And Augustine also deplored the fascination with the munera as incompatible with Christian life.
But the Christian emperors didn't immediately ban them outright, did they? It seems more complicated.
It is a complex picture. Constantine the Great, for instance, in 315 AD, condemned child snatchers to be thrown ad bestias to the beasts in the arena.
Ouch.
But then, 10 years later, He forbade forcing criminals to fight to the death as gladiators, suggesting they should instead be sent to the mines. This has often been interpreted as a ban on gladiatorial combat.
Okay, sounds like a ban.
Yet, surprisingly, in the last year of his life, Constantine granted the people of Hispelum the right to celebrate his rule with gladiatorial games.
What? So he banned it, but then allowed it?
His stance was uh, not absolute, let's say. Later emperors like Valentinian, I attempted to limit the expenses of Gladiatoria Munera, and Theodosius, I banned pagan festivals in 393 AD.
That sounds more definitive.
It pointed that way. However, the legal end of gladiator games in the Western Roman Empire is typically attributed to Honorius in 399 and again in 404 AD, supposedly influenced by the martyrdom of St. Telemachus, who tried to stop a gladiatorial munus.
The monk who jumped into the arena.
That's the traditional story. Valentinian III reiterated the ban in 438 AD, and while gladiator contests waned, Venetians, the animal hunts, continued for some time after.
So the animal hunts outlasted the gladiators.
They did. By this point, the public's interest had shifted anyway. The Byzantine Empire favored theatrical shows and chariot races, which received imperial subsidies. So it wasn't a single decree, but rather a combination of economic hardship, evolving religious views, and, frankly, changing public tastes that led to the eventual fading of gladiatorial combat.
Right.
What's fascinating here is to see how deeply ingrained the games were, requiring multiple attempts and shifting societal norms to finally bring them to an end.
So a confluence of economic pressures, changing religious beliefs, and shifting public tastes seems to have led to the eventual decline. Now let's talk about how these massive events were actually organized. Who was in charge of putting on these spectacles? It sounds complicated.
The organization definitely evolved over time. The earliest munera were held at or near the tomb of the deceased and were organized by the munerator, that's the one making the offering, the giver.
The giver of the gift.
Precisely. Later, games were often put on by an editor, who could be the munerator or an official employed by them. In the Republic, private citizens could own and train gladiators or lease them from a lanista, the owner of a gladiator training school.
The lanista. Right.
However, from the Principate onwards, so the empire basically, private citizens needed imperial permission to hold munera and own gladiators, and the role of the editor became increasingly tied to state officialdom.
More state control.
Yeah. Legislation by Claudius even required lower-ranking magistrates to personally subsidize a portion of the costs of games in their communities. Bigger games were funded by senior magistrates, and the largest and most lavish were, of course, paid for by the emperor himself.
It sounds like a complex web of private enterprise and state control. Now let's turn our attention to the gladiators themselves. We've talked about their origins, but what were the different types of gladiators you might have seen in the arena?
There were different styles, right? Oh, definitely. The earliest types were often named after Rome's enemies: the Samnite, the Thracian, and the Gaul. The Samnite, heavily armed and probably the most popular, was eventually renamed the Secutor, and the Gaul became the Murmillo after these groups were conquered and assimilated.
So names changed as politics changed.
Pretty much. In the mid-Republic, it seems gladiators of similar types often fought each other. But in the later Republic and early Empire, more diverse and fantasy types were introduced, often pitted against dissimilar but complementary opponents.
Fantasy types. Like what?
A classic example is the Retiarius, the net man. He was lightly armored with only a left arm and shoulder guard and wielded a net, trident, and dagger against the heavily armored and helmeted Secutor.
The net guy, yeah, I've seen pictures.
Exactly. Literary references and artistic depictions give us glimpses of other types, including those who fought from chariots or horseback, and the cestus fighters, armed with potentially lethal boxing gloves that likely originated in Greece.
Boxing gloves? Really?
Well, more like studded leather wraps. Pretty brutal. The trade in gladiators became an empire-wide enterprise subject to official supervision. Rome's military successes provided a steady supply of soldier prisoners.
Prisoners of war.
Right. While the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, actually saw an increase in slaves condemned to the arena as punishment and the rise of paid volunteers, the Octorati.
The volunteers again. Why would they volunteer?
Well, for the poor and non-citizens, joining a gladiator school offered a trade, regular sustenance, housing, and a chance, maybe a slim chance, at fame and fortune.
A chance is better than nothing, I guess.
For some, yes. Even emperors like Tiberius and Nero offered significant incentives to attract and retain gladiators. So you see, the arena offered a brutal but sometimes surprisingly viable, albeit often short-lived, career path for those with few other options.
It's interesting to think of it as a profession, albeit a very, very dangerous one. And what about women in the arena? We hear about female gladiators, gladiatrices. How common were they? Was that a real thing?
It was a real thing, but female gladiators appear to have been relatively rare. They emerged in the 60s AD as markers of particularly lavish, maybe even exotic, spectacles.
Exotic, okay.
Nero famously had Ethiopian women fight in a munus to impress a visiting king. Romans seem to have viewed the idea of female gladiators with a mix of novelty, entertainment, and even absurdity based on writers like Juvenal and Petronius.
They found it weird.
Seems like it. Domitian's reign included a munus with female gladiators described as Amazons, and there's a relief from Halicarnassus that depicts two female combatants named Amazon and Achillea in a drawn match.
Amazon and Achillea, cool names.
Yeah. An inscription from Ostia praises a local elite for being the first to arm women for the games there. Gladiatrices likely followed similar training and regulations as their male counterparts.
Same training.
Probably. Now, Roman morality generally dictated that gladiators should be from the lowest social classes, and emperors who disregarded this faced criticism. Cassius Dio noted that when Titus used female gladiators, they were of acceptably low status.
So low status was key.
Yes. However, some viewed female gladiators of any class as a sign of moral corruption. Septimius Severus ultimately banned their use around 200 AD, possibly due to a negative crowd reaction to an attempt to introduce female athletics in Rome. It seems their appearance was more about exotic spectacle than a regular feature of the games.
So a brief and perhaps controversial chapter in the history of the games. Now, it's almost unbelievable, but some emperors themselves participated in the arena, right? Actually fought.
Yes, incredibly. Caligula, Titus, Hadrian, Lucius Verus, Caracalla, Geta, and Didius Julianus were all reported to have performed in the arena, though typically with minimal real risk.
Minimal risk. So not exactly facing death then.
Probably not. Claudius famously and disprovingly, according to commentators, fought a whale trapped in the harbor.
Fought a whale. Okay, that's different.
But Commodus was perhaps the most fanatical imperial participant. He compelled the Roman elite to attend his performances as a gladiator, pisterius, or venator. Most of his gladiatorial fights were bloodless affairs using wooden swords, and he, unsurprisingly, always emerged victorious.
Shocker.
He even had Nero's colossal statue restyled in his own image as Hercules Reborn, proclaiming himself champion of secutors. He also staged elaborate, likely carefully managed, feats like killing 100 lions in a single day and decapitating an ostrich.
Killing 100 lions, staged or not, that's something.
And for these performances, he drew a massive stipend from the public treasury. It really blurs the line between emperor and entertainer, doesn't it? Or maybe just emperor and egomaniac.
It sounds more like performance art than actual gladiatorial combat in his case. Wow. Okay, now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the games themselves. What kind of preparations went into these massive events? It must have been a huge undertaking.
Oh, huge. Gladiator games were heavily advertised well in advance on billboards that detailed the occasion, the sponsor, editor, the venue, the date, and the number of gladiator pairs' ordinary schedule.
Like movie posters.
Kind of, yeah. They would also highlight any accompanying venations, beast hunts, executions, music, and even any special amenities for the spectators. Things like awnings, water sprinklers, food, maybe even door prizes.
Door prizes. At the Colosseum.
Apparently so. For serious enthusiasts and gamblers, a detailed program called a libellus was distributed on the day of the munus. This listed the names, types, and fight records of the gladiator pairs and their order of appearance.
That's for the gamblers.
Exactly. Even left-handed gladiators were advertised as a rare and advantageous novelty.
Lefty advantage.
Right. And the night before the munus, the gladiators were given a formal banquet, offering them an opportunity to settle their affairs. This event was likely both a personal and a public affair, potentially including even those condemned to die the next day, and served as a final opportunity to generate publicity for the upcoming games.
Quite a contrast, isn't it? A lavish feast before facing potential death.
It really is. A blend of marketing, ritual, and maybe a last supper of sorts.
So what did the actual day of the games look like? What was the sequence of events? Walk us through it.
Okay, so official munera in the early imperial era followed a fairly standard format, the munus legitimum. The day began with a grand procession, the pompa, entering the arena.
The big entrance.
Definitely. It was led by lictors bearing the fasces, those bundles of rods with an axe, symbols of the magistrate editor's power over life and death. They were followed by trumpeters playing fanfares, images of the gods brought in to witness the proceedings, a scribe to record the outcomes, and a man carrying the palm branch for the victors.
Oh, the ceremony.
Oh, yes. The magistrate editor entered with a retinue carrying arms and armor, and the gladiators presumably came last. The entertainments often started with Venetians' The Beast Hunts, featuring bestiarii, specialized beast fighters.
Kicking off with the animals?
Usually. Next came the Ludi Meridiani, the midday games, which had variable content but commonly involved executions of Noxi, criminals condemned to death. Some were subjected to fatal reenactments of myths.
Oof, mythological reenactments ending in death. Grim.
Extremely. While gladiators might act as executioners, both the crowd and the gladiators themselves generally preferred the dignity of a fair contest. There were also comedy fights, some potentially lethal and crude burlesques, perhaps even involving musicians dressed as animals.
Comedy fights, that sounds bizarre.
It was a full day of rather intense entertainment, ranging from the gruesome to the, well, theatrical and sometimes just strange.
It sounds like a long and varied day of entertainment, with a significant shift in tone from the animal hunts and executions to the gladiatorial combats. What about the gladiators' equipment? We see different types depicted in art. The gear must have been important.
Absolutely crucial. Their equipment, their armatures, were key to their fighting style and identification. Informal warm-up matches using blunted weapons might occur, and some unira even used blunted weapons throughout.
Practice weapons first.
Sometimes. Before the scheduled matches, the editor or a representative would inspect the weapons in a probadio armorum, checking they were legit. The actual armatures could be incredibly costly, some flamboyantly decorated with exotic materials.
Dinged out armor.
You could say that. The helmets and shin guards found in places like Pompeii and Herculaneum give us tangible examples of this equipment. As we mentioned earlier, different gladiator types had distinct sets of armor and weaponry, often inspired by Rome's enemies.
Like the Samnite or Thracian.
Exactly. To give you a clearer picture, the heavily armored Murmillo typically had a peach-crested helmet, while the agile Ricornarius relied on his net and trident for offense and minimal armor for speed. These stark differences in gear made for compelling and varied matchups.
And when the actual combat began, what was that like? Was it just chaotic violence, or was there a degree of skill and even rules involved? It sounds brutal, but was it just brutality?
Well, while the spectacle was undoubtedly violent, combats between experienced gladiators demonstrated a considerable degree of skill and even, you could say, stagecraft.
Stagecraft. Interesting.
Yes, spectators who were knowledgeable about the games valued bravado and technical skill over mere bloodshed. Lightly armed fighters like the Ricornarius would tire less quickly than heavily armored opponents, with most bouts lasting around 10 to 20 minutes probably.
10, 20 minutes. That's quite a long time to fight for your life.
It is. In the late Republic, as many as 10 to 13 matches might occur in an afternoon. Spectators generally preferred to watch well-matched ordinarii with complementary fighting styles, though these were the most expensive to stage.
Quality over quantity?
For the connoisseurs, yes. Less popular were general melees involving lower-skilled gladiators. Sometimes a match winner might have to face a fresh opponent, a tertiarius or suppositious.
A bonus round?
Of sorts. Gladiators who were reluctant to fight could be whipped or goaded into action. Importantly, trained gladiators were expected to follow professional rules of combat, overseen by a senior referee, the summa rudis, and an assistant, both equipped with staffs, rudes, to intervene.
So there were refs with sticks.
Essentially, yes. Referees could pause or even stop bouts to allow for rest and refreshment. Music, played on instruments like trumpets, water organs, and horns, accompanied the events, building tension during combat and the gladiators' appeals to the crowd.
Music, too. Wow.
So it wasn't just about brute force. There was a real art and tradition to gladiatorial combat, believe it or not.
So not just brutal fighting, but a performance with its own set of skills and conventions. Now, what determined victory and defeat? And what were the rewards for a winning gladiator? Besides, living.
Right. Survival was key. A gladiator won by overcoming or killing his opponent. Victors received a palm branch and an award from the editor. An exceptional fighter might earn a laurel crown and money from the appreciative crowd.
Cash prizes.
Could be substantial. For those originally condemned to the arena damnati, the greatest reward was manumission freedom, symbolized by the rudis, a wooden training sword or staff given by the editor.
The wooden sword meant freedom.
It did. The famous match between Priscus and Varus, who fought so valiantly to a draw, resulted in both receiving victory and a rudis from Titus. But some gladiators, like Flamma, who was awarded the rudis 4 times, actually chose to remain gladiators.
4 times. Why stay?
Fame, fortune, who knows? A defeated gladiator could acknowledge defeat by raising a finger ad digitum, appealing to the referee to stop the fight, and defer to the editor, whose decision usually depended on the crowd's reaction.
Thumbs up, thumbs down.
Well, the famous police verso, the turn thumb signal, is ambiguous. We don't know for sure if thumb up meant live and down meant die, or the other way around, or something else entirely. But the crowd's desire played a big role.
Okay.
While early munera often meant death for the defeated, later, especially during the imperial era, sparing a well-fought gladiator, missio, became common, except in matches advertised as sin mission without reprieve.
So Mithysio meant they were spared.
Correct. Contracts between the editor and lanista might even include compensation for unexpected deaths. Under Augustus, sin mission was officially banned, reflecting both economic realities. Trained gladiators were expensive and maybe popular notions of justice. Popular fighters were more likely to be spared.
Makes sense. Protect the stars.
Ultimately, the editor made the final decision on life or death. Regardless of the outcome, gladiators were bound by oath to accept the editor's decision.
However,
There were instances where gladiators defied this, like the case of the Ricciari, who yielded but then fought back when ordered to die.
ooh, defiance.
It shows that even within this highly structured and violent world, there were moments of, well, unpredictability and resistance.
So victory could bring freedom and fame, but defeat often meant death, though not always immediately. What happened to the gladiators who were killed in the arena? How are their bodies treated? It sounds grim.
It was grim. A gladiator refused missio, was dispatched by his opponent. A good death was valued, meaning the gladiator wouldn't beg for mercy or cry out and would offer his throat willingly. Seneca described this as giving even inexperienced men the courage not to avoid the inevitable.
A stoic death.
Exactly. The body was then placed on a couch of Libitina, the goddess of funerals, and taken to the arena morgue. There it was stripped of armor and likely had its throat cut to ensure death.
Just to be sure.
Seems so. Tertullian described a more degrading removal process for those in the Ludi Meridiani in Carthage, involving officials dressed as underworld deities like Dispater, maybe Charon confirming death with a mallet and a heated wand before dragging the body away.
Wow, like characters from Hades.
It's unclear if these were gladiators or Noxi, the condemned criminals. But pathological evidence suggests mallets were indeed used on some gladiator skulls. Gladiators who disgraced themselves might have suffered similar indignities as Noxi, being dragged away without a quick death.
No dignity in death either.
For some, no. The bodies of Noxi, and possibly some damnati, were often thrown into rivers or dumped unburied, denying them funeral rites and condemning their spirits, according to Roman belief. Ordinary citizens were buried outside city limits, while professional gladiators had their own separate cemeteries, marked by the social stigma of infamia.
Separate cemetery.
It's a stark reminder of the brutal reality underlying the spectacle and their perpetual outsider status.
A grim but important aspect of the reality of the games. But some gladiators were remembered, weren't they? We have evidence of remembrance and even epitaphs. It wasn't total oblivion.
No, definitely not for all of them. Despite their low social status, efforts were made to remember some gladiators. They could subscribe to unions, collegia, which provided for proper burial and sometimes pensions for families.
Gladiator unions, really?
Yeah, burial clubs, essentially. Their familia, which could include their lanista, comrades, and blood relatives, might fund funerals and memorials to uphold their reputation, perhaps the lanista's reputation too.
Makes sense for the business.
Monuments often recorded career details. The number of appearances, victories, sometimes shown with engraved crowns, defeats, career length, and age at death. Some even included the gladiators type.
Like baseball cards?
Kind of. Wealthy editors might commission artwork depicting particularly successful games, including named gladiators. While evidence of gladiators' personal religious beliefs is scarce, it's unlikely they were specifically dedicated to Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. She seems to have represented more of an imperial fortuna connected to the games themselves.
So not a personal patron saint.
Probably not in most cases. Many gladiator epitaphs actually blame Nemesis, fate, deception, or treachery for their deaths, rather than acknowledging the opponent's skill, perhaps, as a way to preserve honor in defeat.
I was robbed, even in death.
Pretty much. The epitaph of Victor, a left-handed gladiator from Thessalonica, exemplifies this. It blames Doom and the liar Penis for his death, while crediting his comrade for avenging him. These small glimpses offer a human perspective on lives lived right on the edge.
These glimpses into their lives and deaths are incredibly poignant. It makes you wonder about their life expectancy. How long did a typical gladiator survive in the arena? It sounds like a short career.
Yeah, often was. A gladiator might typically fight in 2 or 3 munera annually, and tragically, an unknown number died in their very first match. Few survived more than 10 contests,
Only 10.
though some exceptions existed, like one guy who reportedly fought 150 times.
And some even lived to a natural death after retirement. One supposedly reached the age of 90.
90 after being a gladiator. That's amazing.
Highly exceptional. Using evidence from first-century gladiator headstones, the average age at death has been calculated around 27, with a mortality rate of about 19 out of every 100 who entered the arena.
So roughly 1 in 5 died each time. Something like that, based on that study. However, some scholars argue that the majority, who likely didn't receive headstones, probably died much younger, maybe between 18 and 25. Over time, the risk of death for defeated gladiators seemed to have increased slightly, perhaps as missio was granted less frequently.
Things got tougher.
Possibly. Estimates suggest that with around 400 arenas across the Roman Empire, there could have been as many as 8,000 deaths annually from executions, combat, and accidents related to the games.
8,000 deaths a year. That scale is just hard to comprehend.
It really puts the phenomenon into perspective, doesn't it? It was industrial scale, spectacle, and death.
Those are sobering statistics. It really underscores the danger they faced constantly. Now let's talk about how these gladiators were trained. Where did they learn their deadly skills? The ludi, right.
Exactly. The school's known as Ludi. The earliest named school was that of Aurelius Scaurus at Capua, around 105 BC. These schools were headed by Linistae, who had near life-and-death power over their gladiatorial familia. That's the whole troop, including slaves and volunteers.
The Lanista held all the power.
Pretty much. Despite their authority, Lanistae were socially stigmatized, kind of grouped with pimps and butchers. Socially infamies.
Low status, even though they ran the show.
Right. Gladiator owners, munerari or editors, on the other hand, typically enjoyed higher social status. The Spartacus Revolt famously originated in a gladiator school owned by Lentulus Batiatus in Capua.
Ah, Spartacus started in a school.
Yep. Fear of uprisings and the political exploitation of gladiators led to increased state restrictions on these schools. By Domitian's time, many had been absorbed by the state, including the 4 major schools in Rome: Ludus Magnus, Dacicus, Gallicus, and Matutinus. That last one trained bestiario, the beast fighters.
State-run gladiator school.
Essentially. In the imperial era, volunteers needed a magistrate's permission to join a school as octorati. Upon entering, they underwent a medical assessment, and their contract, octoramentum, specified their performance frequency, fighting style, and earnings.
They signed contracts.
They did. Bankrupts or debtors could negotiate debt payment with the lanista. All prospective gladiators, whether volunteer or condemned, swore a sacred oath.
Sacramentum.
An oath to fight.
To endure burning, beating, binding, and death by the sword. Pretty serious stuff. Training was overseen by retired gladiators, and novices progressed through a hierarchy of grades, Pallas. They trained with blunted wooden weapons, focusing on choreographed fighting styles, elegant technique, and accepting death stoically.
Discipline and technique.
And stoicism. Those condemned ad litem were likely branded or tattooed a stigma. They were housed in cells around a central practice arena, segregated by type and status, and discipline could be severe, even lethal.
Lethal discipline.
Yeah, it sounds like a very structured and hierarchical environment, almost like a military academy, but with a much, much higher risk factor.
It sounds like a rigorous and often brutal training regime. And what about their diet and medical care? You'd think they wouldn't be a high priority given their status as slaves or condemned men. Well, surprisingly, despite the harsh discipline, gladiators represented a significant financial investment, so they were generally well-fed and received pretty good medical care.
Really? Good food.
Relatively speaking.
Okay.
Their high-energy, primarily vegetarian diet consisted of things like barley, beans, oatmeal, maybe some ash for minerals, and dried fruit. It earned them the nickname hordearii, eaters of barley.
Barley eaters.
Yeah. While Romans considered barley inferior food, it was believed to strengthen the body. Regular massage and quality medical attention were also provided to help them endure the intense training and recover from injuries.
Massages and doctors.
Absolutely. The renowned physician Galen even received part of his medical training at a gladiator school in Pergamum. He wrote about treating their wounds.
Galen worked with gladiators. Wow.
It's a surprising detail, isn't it? These fighters, often seen as disposable, were actually valuable assets who required significant upkeep to keep performing.
So a surprising level of care given their circumstances. Now let's delve into their legal and social status a bit more. It seems incredibly complex and contradictory. Part slave, part celebrity.
It was indeed a unique and often paradoxical position. There are few modern parallels. In Roman law, those condemned to the arena or gladiator schools, damnati ad ludum, were serviponi slaves of penalty. They were essentially under a death sentence unless manumitted.
Slaves of penalty.
Hadrian issued rescripts regulating the time frame for their execution or training. Only slaves found guilty of specific offenses could be sentenced to the arena. Those citizens could be stripped of citizenship and then sentenced. Even freed slaves could be re-enslaved and sent to the arena for certain crimes.
No escaping it sometimes.
Arena punishment was used for offenses like banditry, theft, arson, and treason. Those deemed particularly obnoxious to the state, noxi, faced the most humiliating punishments, being thrown to the beasts, or forced to kill each other.
Just horrific.
Less severely judged individuals, condemned ad ludum venatorium, to the beast hunt, or gladiatorium, to the gladiator school, had a slight chance of survival and maybe earning some respect. Highly admired auctorati, those volunteers who fought after manumission, held a particularly ambiguous status.
The freedmen who went back.
Yeah. While they were technically free, Roman law restricted them from offering services that endangered their lives, and their voluntary auctoratio, the contract, legally re-enslaved them for the duration of their contract.
So they were enslaved again by choice.
Legally, yes. Anyone who appeared in the arena were considered infames, suffering social dishonor that excluded them from most citizen rights.
Infames. The infamous ones.
Right. Even popular and wealthy auctorati had a marginal legal and social standing. They couldn't vote, plead in court, or leave a will unless manumitted. Yet there's evidence of informal practices allowing them to bequeath property and even own slaves themselves.
Gladiators owning slaves. That's ironic.
It is. While upper-class participation was generally forbidden, some individuals, driven by payment, glory, or maybe even revenge, did enter the arena, risking their status. It paints a picture of a society with very strict social hierarchies, yet one where the brutal spectacle of the arena created its own strange set of rules and exceptions.
It paints a picture of individuals caught between worlds, neither fully slave nor fully free, simultaneously celebrated and reviled. Now, the games took place in specific structures, didn't they? Tell us about the amphitheaters. The Colosseum is the famous one, but there were others.
Oh, hundreds. As Munera grew in scale and popularity, existing open spaces like the Forum Romanum were adapted with temporary seating. However, by the late Republic, Cicero still described gladiator shows as ticketed events.
Tickets even back then.
Seems so. In imperial times, poor citizens receiving the corn dole were often allocated free seating, possibly by lottery, while others paid. Ticket scalpers locari even emerged.
Scalpers. Some things never change.
Right. The earliest known Roman amphitheater was built in Pompeii around 70 BC. The first in Rome was a remarkable wooden structure by Gaius Scribonius Curio. In 53 BC, supposedly 2 wooden theaters back-to-back that could rotate to form an amphitheater.
A rotating theater. That's ingenious.
Quite the feat of engineering. The first part-stone amphitheater in Rome was inaugurated during Augustus's reign. Of course, the most iconic is the Colosseum, the Amphitheatrum Flavium, which could seat maybe 50,000 spectators.
50,000 people watching this.
Inaugurated by Titus in 80 AD, it was funded by the spoils of the Jewish revolt and served as a personal gift from the emperor to the Roman people. Amphitheaters typically had an oval plan with tiered seating surrounding the arena. These spaces offered opportunities for public expression and even petitioning the editor or the sponsor.
People could shout requests?
Or demands. Factions supporting different gladiators and gladiator types could become quite vocal, sometimes even violent. Augustus even prescribed seating arrangements as a form of social control: senators here, equestrians there, women way up top.
Segregated seating.
Yes. The management of the crowd in the amphitheater became a measure of an emperor's popularity and the stability of his rule. It's fascinating how these buildings became central to Roman urban life and social dynamics.
And these factions and rivalries among spectators, they weren't just passive viewers, were they? It sounds like they got really into it.
Absolutely not passive. Popular factions fiercely supported their favorite gladiators and gladiator types. Under Augustan legislation, as we said, the Samnite was renamed the Secutor, and their supporters became the Secutari. Lighter types, like the Thraex, had a smaller shield. The Parma and their supporters were called Parmulari.
Secutari versus Parmulari, like team jerseys.
Kind of. Emperors often had their own preferences, with Titus and Trajan favoring the Parmulari and Domitian the Secutari. Nero seemed to enjoy the occasional brawls between these enthusiastic and sometimes violent factions, though he would call in troops if things escalated too far.
He enjoyed the fights in the stands, too.
Seems like it. Local rivalries also existed, as famously seen in the riot between Pompeian and Nucerian spectators during a ludi in Pompeii. That led to many deaths, and Nero imposing a 10-year ban on gladiator munera there.
A 10-year ban for rioting. Serious stuff.
It shows the passion involved. It's almost like ancient sports fandom taken to an extreme with real-world, sometimes fatal consequences.
It sounds like the amphitheater was a microcosm of Roman society, with all its passions and divisions on full display. Now, thinking about the broader impact, what role did gladiatorial games play in the overall fabric of Roman life? How often did these things happen?
It's difficult to know the exact total number of gladiatoria munera held throughout Roman history, but they were clearly a significant part of the cultural landscape for centuries. Many included venations, the beast hunts, and in the later empire, some events might have consisted solely of animal hunts.
Just the animals sometimes.
Possibly. While munera were held during various festivals, like the Megalesia in April, the calendar of Furius Dionysius Philocalus from 354 AD suggests that by that late date, gladiator games were less frequent compared to theatrical shows, and especially chariot races.
Chariot races took over.
They became hugely popular, yes.
Yeah.
Major gladiator games were traditionally held in December, during the Saturnalia, a festival associated with chaos, reversal, death, and renewal. So while their prominence might have shifted over time, they remained a significant form of public entertainment and ritual for a very long time.
And we've touched on the military aspects and the origins, but what was the ongoing role of gladiatorial combat in the Roman military? Was there still a connection?
Oh, definitely. Livy famously said, "A man who knows how to conquer in war is a man who knows how to arrange a banquet and put on a show," highlighting the connection between military success and public spectacle.
War and entertainment.
Rome was essentially a military aristocracy. 10 years of military service was a prerequisite for holding public office. And devotio, which we can understand as a profound willingness to sacrifice oneself for the greater good, was central to the Roman military ideal.
Self-sacrifice.
Exactly. The Punic Wars, particularly the devastating defeat at Cannae, had a lasting impact. Scipio Africanus punished deserters harshly. The Senate consulted the Sibylline books, resorted to human sacrifices, and armed slaves. Hannibal even made Roman captives fight each other, much like a munus,
Hannibal did that.
according to Livy. So the munus came to represent a kind of military self-sacrificial ideal embodied in the gladiator's oath. By taking this voluntary oath, even a slave could potentially achieve a form of Romanitas, Romanness, and virtus, manly virtue, and possibly earn missio or even freedom.
Virtue through combat.
In a way. Gladiator schools also influenced Roman military training methods, particularly after defeats like the Battle of Arasio, prompting changes in training to emphasize individual combat skills alongside formation fighting.
Learning from the gladiator.
Yeah. The military were avid fans of the games, often supervised the schools, and some units even owned their own gladiator troops. As military service terms increased, a career as a volunteer gladiator might have seemed an appealing alternative for some soldiers.
Join the arena instead of the legion.
Potentially. Gladiators even served in armies during civil wars, like the Year of Four Emperors, and Marcus Aurelius drafted gladiators into his army. Octavian acquired Antony's entire gladiator troop after defeating him. So the link between the arena and the battlefield was surprisingly strong and multifaceted.
So a surprising and deep connection between the seemingly civilian entertainment and the very core of Roman military culture. Finally, let's consider the more abstract aspects: religion, ethics, and sentiments surrounding these brutal spectacles. How did Romans feel about it all?
Roman writing reveals a deep, deep ambivalence towards the gladiatoria munera. Even the most elaborate games were rooted in ancestral rituals and framed by religious rites, connecting to the veneration of the Deities, the spirits of the dead.
So a religious element remained.
Underlying it, yes. Their popularity made state corruption inevitable, with figures like Cicero recognizing their political importance as a way to engage the populace, keep them happy. Yet, despite the public adoration, gladiators were often set apart and despised. The term gladiator itself could be used as an insult, highlighting their infamous status.
Admired but despised.
Exactly. Some Roman writers, like Silius Italicus, viewed the bloodshed at banquets, a possible precursor to gladiatorial combat, as a morally corrupting Campanian influence that threatened traditional Roman values. The idea of death as entertainment without a clear moral or religious purpose was seen by some as polluting to Roman society.
Corrupting influence.
That was one view. While some Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Marcus Aurelius found a perverse kind of virtue in the gladiators' obedience and equanimity in death, seeing it as a demonstration of human resilience.
Finding the good in it.
Others like Seneca also criticized the mob's bloodthirsty appetite for the ludi meridiani, the midday executions. He found that particularly repulsive.
Seneca wasn't a fan of that part.
No. Ovid's satirical writings suggest a dangerously sexual atmosphere could pervade the amphitheater, leading Augustus to try and enforce those seating prescriptions, separating women from the action. Scandals involving high-caste spectators, usual women, and gladiators were not uncommon. Juvenal wrote a scathing piece about a senator's wife, Epia, running off with her gladiator lover, Sergius.
Scandals.
And Pompeian graffiti calls one gladiator, Celadus, the sigh of the girls.
Sigh of the girls. Like a rock star.
Pretty much. Even in the later empire, the term bustuarius, literally funeral man or tomb fighter, was used disparagingly for gladiators. Tertullian captured the paradox perfectly. Romans glorified and degraded gladiators simultaneously, admired for their skill, excluded from civic life. It's a really complex moral landscape that the games inhabited.
It's a fascinating tapestry of contradictions, and even in their art and culture, we see this pervasive presence of gladiators, don't we? They were everywhere.
Indeed. Images of gladiators were widespread across all social classes. You find them in decorations in public spaces like Delos, and in countless mosaics from the 2nd to 4th centuries AD. These are invaluable for understanding combat, types, rules.
The mosaics are key evidence.
Huge. Evidence is also on ceramics, lamps, gems, jewelry, reliefs, paintings, statuary. You name it. There's the famous Borghese gladiator mosaic, the Bignor Roman villa mosaic showing Cupids dressed as gladiators.
Cupids as gladiators.
Yeah, kind of cute but weird. Souvenir ceramics with named gladiators have been found. Graffiti from Pompeii and Herculaneum vividly illustrates how deeply the Munera permeated daily life, offering information about specific gladiators, their records, their status.
Graffiti tells us a lot.
Loads. Pliny the Elder even noted the popularity of gladiator portraiture, and today we even have modern reenactors attempting to recreate gladiator troops and their combat in as accurate a way as possible, showing the enduring appeal of this aspect of Roman culture.
It's incredible how this ancient phenomenon continues to capture our imagination. So, as we conclude this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about gladiators and their world? What should people remember?
Well, I think we've seen that gladiatorial combat was far, far more than just mindless violence. It was this complex blend of entertainment, ritual, and social display that profoundly impacted Roman life for nearly 1,000 years.
1,000 years. Amazing.
And it existed in this web of paradoxes. Gladiators were despised, yet admired for their martial skill, often enslaved, yet capable of achieving fleeting fame and even freedom. Performers of brutal violence, yet bound by specific rules and expectations. The games really served as a lens through which Roman society grappled with ideas of courage, death, justice, entertainment, and the very nature of spectacle itself.
And it leaves us with that lingering question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Considering this intricate mix of brutality and honor, entertainment and social control, what does this enduring fascination with gladiators truly reveal about, well, human nature and our ongoing relationship with spectacle?
That's the big question, isn't it?
That's certainly something to continue pondering. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of gladiators. We encourage you to continue exploring the rich history and enduring legacy of the Roman arena.